Welcome back, everyone, to our STEM speaker series, where we try to bring a bunch of diverse, talented people together so they can think, share, and collaborate. Today, we have Dr. Jennifer Adams, who was born and raised in Brooklyn. So we have someone from a very cold region. um, and she has, again, very diverse backgrounds. After college, she started in physical therapy before transitioning to education. And even within education, she took a lot of paths, and that's great. She was a high school biology teacher, a field instructor for Upward Bound, and then worked in the American Museum of Natural History before ultimately going into STEM education on a collegiate level. Now, what we're here today to hear more about is her research. So her work is based on two focus areas: urban-based place or urban place-based and environment education, and informal science learning, along with teacher learning identity and agency and youth agency and identity. Her research now moves into examining the intersection of creativity in STEM and post-secondary science teaching within learning contexts. And so, with that being said, Dr. Adams, take us away.
Yes, well, thanks again for inviting me to this space. And so what I wanted to do, and let me just share let me go to screen share again. Yeah, I hate this when you have like all of these layers open and it's like you have to peel away the layers to find the screen that you want to find. And here I am, and I found it. So what I wanted to do today, just because a lot of my work that I have done in, informal science education and place-based education, they all have like underpinnings and really thinking about, well, what is science, what structures science, and why, what are some approaches that we can think about in science. So I just wanted to kind of give you an overview of that work I'm doing, and then towards the end I can talk about some of the more, recent, it's not recent data collection, but more recent analysis on thinking about teacher education and identity. So the general overview today is to think about images and narratives of, cultural narratives about science, historical underpinnings of STEM, colonial science, and then thinking about how can you take like a decolonial stance towards not only education, research, and practice. What time, up until what time do I have, just so I'm keeping track? Because I know, and again, I apologize for being late, but it was just like we were back on campus after being off campus for a while. So yeah.
We usually finish up around 1 o'clock, and so if you want to leave a few minutes towards the end for questions and discussion, but whatever you want to do, or questions throughout, it's up to you. We try to finish up around 1 is usually our time.
All right, so
I know I will be able to stay longer, and I'm sure certainly other people could too, if possible.
Yeah, so that's like noon my time. So okay.
Yes,
all right, so I have that. So one thing that I start with, and we won't do this as an activity, but something for you to kind of do on your own is just to do like a Google search on image and looking at what comes up for science and what comes up for scientists. Now, when I do this, I'm very happy that there are more diverse images of scientists. Like you will see more images of women, you will see more images of people of color in science. But one thing that still remains is that very sanitized acultural look. Like you will still see a lot of people in labs, lab coats, goggles, test tubes, and all that kind of stuff. And while we know safety first, and that's always important, but we also know that that's not the only images of what science is and what scientists do. So there is still this portrayal that even though they're diverse people represented, but everybody still looks like clones in what they're wearing. So it's still this acultural, like it's neutral, it's objective, it's like these very unified images of science. So I would just encourage you just to do that little exercise on your own and just see what comes up for you. And who knows, maybe the search engine has changed since the last time I did this a couple of months ago, but that's what I see always comes up. So when we think about those images of science, we also have to think about, especially for us here in North America, what what are those things that underpin how we are thinking about science? And it not only starts because we can think about the race for space, and that's an area, that's a time when STEM, as science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, it was codified as a way to promote the competitive of the United States, like in reaching space. This was at the height of the Cold War, and as we know, it seems like some of that is kind of being reproduced all over again. And now we have like this corporate race to space where we have people that with a lot of money that are engaged in this as well. So we have to think about, like, this is where the history of STEM is codified, and where if you look at some of the older like governmental documents, it really specifically talks about STEM for economic competitiveness, and so it goes back to what I always like to bring up, every time I think about like meritocracy and capitalism, this song from the 80s, and of course I'm dating myself, always comes to mind. Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five is called The Message, and the lyrics that shape this is all about money. Ain't a damn thing funny. You gotta have a con in this land of milk and honey. So thinking about the con, and that con is who has access to those resources, and how do they have access to those resources, and who is left out of those resources, because those people that are left out, which are mostly like racialized, minoritized, lower income people, their ideas and their perspectives are also being left out of science. So the science that is involved in that race to space or in that economic competitiveness are not necessarily representative of the people whose voices are left out. So those people's values are not represented, people's needs are not represented. So all of that is not included in what we have grown to know and associate with STEM. So we can also think about this dominant ideology of STEM. Where did this come from? It didn't start with the space race, but it started well further back. It started further back, like around the 18th century, where they started to, well, first it was during, I'm sorry, let me go back. First it was during like the Great Plague, which we, again, it's really weird how, there's like a lot of this stuff is like history kind of reproducing itself, even though we're at a position now where we can make different, or hopefully make different decisions. But they had to explain away why, first of all, why there was this rampant death happening across Europe, and why so many people, were succumbing to this disease. So this began that kind of separation of I guess spirit, humanity's lived experience from science, in order to to be able to define what's happening. So it's kind of the beginning of the separation of the knower from the known. So this started to underlie this whole notion of logic and reason guiding STEM, rather than looking at human emotions and aesthetics and all of those other more effective types of traits that we all as human beings know that are important to considering how we know and understand our world. But that separation started to be, well, no, we can't use humans' emotions and lived experience. We really have to approach this from this rational, objective perspective that was largely coming at the time from the more, upper, like educated European classes, and not necessarily the what we would consider like the middle class, working class people who are living or just going about their daily lives. And then race science is something that emerged from these types of ideology, where first they had to wanted to explain the differences between human beings, but then also wanted to explain away why it was okay to enslave certain people, why it was okay to to take over the lands and the resources of certain people. And Sylvia Wynter, when she talks about like race science in the Sen, she talks about this overrepresentation of man. And during this time, you know, European man became the pinnacle, or became at the hierarchy of humanness, and all other human beings were described in relation to this pinnacle of man. So that not only included women that were less in the hierarchy, but then racialized people. So here we have like the famous statue that's in front of the American Museum of Natural History that has finally been removed after much protesting. But this is Teddy Roosevelt high on a horse, and they had the images or these statues of an African and an indigenous man flanked alongside him, and you can see where they're kind of like the African man is very like his view is downcast. The indigenous man, which I find it like the irony of it is that he is gazing out into Central Park, which was once indigenous land. Well, actually all of Manhattan was. And then with the African, even though this is representative of a continental, but there was also a historic African American village, Seneca Village in Central Park, that was raised to have this, this park. There were like sheep, sheep herding. There was a whole bunch of things happening there. And so, in essence, to use Sylvia Wynter's terminology, indigenous, African, other racialized people were deselected from that category of human being. So, in other words, man, Homo economicus, European man was the pinnacle of humanness, and everything else and everybody else was deselected from this. And so this helped to shape the race science. And what I found interesting in doing some of this work is that even some of the early founders of the Museum of Natural History were a part of the eugenicist movement. So when we think about that, and we think about museums in general and science that is portrayed in museums, there is this underpinning that we have to think about, because there's a lot of older dioramas, there's a lot of older, like very old things that people value in museums, but these are told from specific perspectives, specific point of views that are representative of this hierarchical triangle that we're looking at now. I always want to press the next button on this, but you have to press it on the screen. So when we think about this underpinning of science, when we think about first the separation of knower from the known and the objectivity of science, and then race science that was emerging from this science, and then we can also think of race science in the sense of with this push for rationality and objectivity. It was also at a time when Europeans were going out and creating these big empires and taking lands from people, taking people from lands, but then also what some people call is a portmanteau biota, and taking and categorizing different living things and non-living things from different lands and putting them into these different types of categories that were not necessarily the ways that they relate to each other in nature. So now things became in these very linear types of ways, these different types of categories and ways of classifying human beings and classifying living things. And all of this underpins how we see science playing out today. So some of the examples that I often share is so that we can look at, the issue of environmental racism. So people who are, especially in North America, African Americans, indigenous people, poor people who are often, or even if they're white, they are deselected from that category of human being, often live in areas that they're more likely to be affected by environmental pollutions. And very interestingly, I just heard this on the radio this morning. There was a very good story about a young, well, I don't know how old he was, I couldn't tell by his voice, but an African-American man who grew up in DC, and he and other Black people have been credited with cleaning up the Anacostia and being responsible for a lot of the wildlife coming back. He's one of, I think he's probably like the only Black falconer, Black falconer, because he became attracted to like raptors, and that became his life. And he was one, he grew up in the projects. He was faced with all kinds of the same types of challenges that young, especially African American and Latino males face when they are growing up in those types of environments. And then I won't go into the reason why those environments are the way that they are. But he recalled one day, because he was actually a drug dealer, where he was in this involved like getting a drug deal or something, and there were people with guns and stuff, and he just saw a red-tailed hawk that he didn't know was a hawk at the time, flying across the window. And I know I'm diverging, I'll come back to the point. And he was just enraptured by it. And they were all like, yo, what are you doing? What are you doing? We have to get this deal done. He goes, no, I'm looking at this bird and how amazing it is. And then he became attracted to that. And so long story short, somebody narked on him. He ended up in jail, but it was while he was in prison that he was able to learn about more environmental things. And when he came out, he was responsible for helping to clean up the river and then to bring back a lot of the wildlife that had been missing for centuries because of DDT and other environmental pollutants. But he says that whenever there are stories that are told about the comeback of the river and the wildlife, they never mention who is responsible for that. And so that's the thing. It's like we, as Black people, you're faced in areas where you are, you're more likely to be exposed to these environmental toxins. But then when you are playing a critical role in helping to clean it up, very rarely given the credit to do so, because Black people are not environmental, and Indigenous people are only environmental when they are out in the wilderness and not living on reservations or in urban centers where they are still exposed to a lot of the same inequities that racialized people are exposed to. So those are just some things. So I think about Marvin Gaye's song, The Ecology, because what I also like to do is I like to borrow from what Gramsci would refer to as organic intellectuals. And these are people who are writing about the lived experiences and writing about them, not in academic books, but in songs, in artwork. It's the same thing like Grandmaster Flash. And Marvin Gaye talked about this in his song, what's going on, and seeing all of these different types of environmental degradation happening in his community. So that's one of the things that I like to talk about. And so I think a lot of us, especially in science education, I know that we know about Henrietta Lacks' story. I usually use this when I'm talking about research ethics in the classes that I teach. But again, thinking about how Black bodies, Indigenous bodies, women's bodies have often been used in scientific research without their consent. Those of you that, and most of you probably should have, if you've taken like the ethics or the IRB course, a lot of those types of policies have come about because of these, these types of, unconsensual research that has been done. We know about like the Tuskegee experiments, all of these things that have been done, and mostly to those vulnerable bodies, which includes Black, Indigenous, and then intersected with prison populations, or people that have been in residential homes because of having different types of disabilities. So this is another thing that we think about science as being neutral and objective, and the wrongs that have been done to different groups of people in the name of science. And then we have the other one. What do we do about the biases in AI? More recently, these biases have shown up with these move to online testing, and then we have students who have, who happen to be more melanated, and they're not these, I forgot what they call it, what the word is, but they're not able to see these students, they're not able to see them, so they have to do all kinds of like contortions and gymnastics with lights and everything in order for them to be visible by these electronic testing systems. And this is because of artificial intelligence, and these are just maybe more they're detrimental to the people experiencing them, but they don't have life consequence. They don't have as bad consequences as being incarcerated, or being unrightly, picked out for, different crimes and things like that, so these are some of the ways, again, when we don't think about the ways that science has been shaped, if we don't examine those things, how these different inadequacies or inequities are reproductive, and they continue to reproduce themselves. Okay, so then we go to healthcare, and a lot of us are aware of health inequities of racialized groups. Again, for in the States, it's mainly like African American, Latinx groups. Here in Canada, it's Indigenous and it's African diasporic groups. So we can think about how this discrimination shows up in many different ways. Healthcare, access and utilization, occupation, housing. So all of these inequities, and then we have the COVID virus, and a lot of the research that has shown up that shows that a lot of the Black people, Indigenous people experience the COVID pandemic more, I guess, acutely than other populations. And these are for many different reasons, like housing, again, going back to the access and utilization of healthcare, occupation. If we can talk about the people who are the essential workers, who, if you look around like any city that you live in and you see who were the essential workers and what they look like. So those were the people who were more exposed to the ill effects of the virus. And, racial bias in pain assessment. There are certain notions about Black people in relation to white people, such as having thicker skin, blood coagulating more quickly, so Black people are less likely to get the adequate pain medication in hospital situations. There were a couple of incidences actually during COVID, one of a Black woman who was actually a medical doctor who died from COVID because even though she was advocating for herself, she did not get the adequate care. And here in Canada, there was an incidence of an Indigenous woman who she was not in a comatose state, but she was in a state where she was able to hear what was happening around her but couldn't respond, and heard nurses making racist comments about her, and she was unable to receive the kind of care. So we think about that in people that are supposed to be trained in order to to heal and to help people, but with these underlying types of biases, certain groups of people do not get the adequate help that they need. And so I always like to think about Zora Neale Hurston, that says if you're silent about your pain, they'll kill you, and say that you enjoyed it. So for us, it is important when we think about science, education, research, whether we're doing it on, or thinking about informal, place-based, land-based education, or formal education as it happens in the classroom, it is very important for us to think about those underlying structures of science and science education in order for us to make those changes necessary, especially for the most racialized and marginalized students and groups. Okay, I didn't want that. And then I also like this, again, going back to organic intellectuals, performance artists, in one of her books, she said, science has not been neutral or colorblind. Hurt could not cure. So when we think about, pain that has been, inflicted on different groups of people in the name of science, and we can think, again, going back to race science and thinking about enslavement and genocide because, people do not know how to occupy a land properly, but, the white colonizers that came, we know what to do with this land and the resources. That's hurt, and that hurt does nothing for, as far as like cure is concerned. So like this kind of moving ahead, what we, in this sense, in advocating for ourselves in different spaces, I like to use this example of this young doctor, and he, medical student who is, on his way to becoming a doctor, that you're not taught to look for skin symptoms, especially that look differently on non-white skin. So he prepared a database specifically to show, how different types of dermatological symptoms or other symptoms too look like on non-white skin. And he's been receiving pictures from all over the world, not only from African people, but from people that, South Asian, people that have different degrees of melanin, just so that when they come into a clinic, a doctor can know what to look for. And more recently, there is that image of a medical image of a black pregnant woman with a black fetus, and a lot of people were surprised to see that, because they've never seen a depiction of other than white person in medical books that are showing like the internal anatomy and things like that. And we, a lot of us would like to think that, if they're just showing the internal anatomy, that's again neutral, but there's still skin covering that anatomy, and just going back to the simple saying, representation matters. And for people to be able to see themselves, and for other people to be able to see, depictions of other people, it then goes to humanize other people and to let us know that, yeah, we all have these, different types of internalized structures. Black women give birth, black women hold fetuses, we have uteruses. So not seen as objects, but actually seen as, as human beings, in need of equal access to medical care and all of those things. So abolition science, I'll come back to that later. So what I wanted to do now is just to talk a little bit about this crit trans heuristic. My students and I, we came up with this heuristic to think about how to approach teaching, learning, and research that has a more critical approach and considers a lot of the different things that I described today. So we propose this as critical because underlying this heuristic is really looking at or thinking about, the ways that power and, and oppression structure different science teaching and learning spaces. So whether, again, that is in a classroom, whether it's in a place-based context, or whether it is in an informal museum type of context. So thinking about how do these structures the different things. And we called it transdisciplinary just because we wanted to discuss this in a more relational sense, that we're not looking at these disciplines in the siloed sense, that again is going back to that, rational, objective way of portraying science, but really looking at how science is lived, and it's lived in a very transdisciplinary way that is not disconnected from how people go about and live their daily lives. It's not disconnected from who we are, who we relate to, and how we relate to different contexts. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to briefly go through each of these different tenets and talk about how we were conceptualizing them. And okay, I always go to the wrong button, but here it is over here. So when we think about contextualize and historicize knowledge, so a lot of what my presentation was about today was about contextualizing and historicizing this knowledge. So thinking about what are those underpinning things? What are those things that we take for granted about knowledge now? What are those things that have been normalized? Because even going back to the, to the notion of anatomy and looking at, images of bodies in medical textbooks, we have long normalized that those models are like with white skin. So now that we see one with black skin, it becomes something that is, novel. But how, like when we think about that, like how do we normalize that range of things so that it doesn't become like a novel thing where we're seeing like a different color skin depicted in a medical textbook that's supposed to be considered neutral or objective. And then when we think about, like history, we can think about the history of the land that we're on for one thing, like, thinking about land-based education, like whose land is it on, what were the original like meanings and interactions with the land, what do people still, what are the still relationships to that land today. So all of these things, and when we, contextual, like who are your students, who are your learners, who are your research participants, what are those things that are important to them? What are their experiences? What perspectives are they bringing into whatever teaching, learning, or research context? And I'm just going to run through these, and and I'd be happy with leaving enough time for Q&A at the end. So, challenging assumptions of neutrality and objectivity through critical inquiry. So always asking those questions like, who is this for? Who is benefiting from this? Who is harmed by this? Who is making those decisions? What voices are left out of these, what voices are left out of those decisions? So we have to think about all of these things because, in science spaces, as we can see, there is no such thing as objectivity. There is always going to be somebody's perspective. Like a meme that I like to share, and I don't have it in this PowerPoint, is a group of a young woman with a group of looking like middle school Girl Scouts, and she's holding a turtle, so I'm guessing that she's a herpetologist, and she's holding a turtle in their hand. And the young women ask, "Oh, do turtles have periods?" And she says, "No." And then they said, do bats have periods? And then she asked, answered the question, yeah, well, they know that one species of bat does. And so the girls were asking other questions like, do they fly when they have their period? Do they rest when they have their period? And the researcher was saying, well, I don't know. And then she says, and then they asked, well, why don't you know? She goes, well, I guess the researchers that did it didn't ask those questions. She goes, oh, and the girls go, oh, so they must have been all boys, right? So that's showing you that perspective matters, because if we even think about primates and how many assumptions about primate behaviors have been made from very male perspectives, and now we're learning much more about primate behavior because now women's perspectives are being considered, different cultures are being considered. So it's not based on this one notion of what families are, what family structures are, and how family or different genders, different age groups relate to one another. So perspective matters. So so decenter hegemonic notions of knowledge production. So again, where are all your resources coming from? Are they all coming from the so-called canon? Are we still teaching the canon? Who are the people who are living their lives that are, as I go back to Gramsci's notion of the organic intellectual? What voice could they add to your research? What voice could they add to what you are teaching? So thinking about how can we expand where different sources of knowledge comes from. And I like to put this example of the tortilla. Well, it reminds me of cassava, which is something that my ancestors and mom and stuff use in Jamaica to create bami. There is a toxin that's in it. You have to know how to process it in order for that toxin to be neutralized, So this is something that people learn from living with the land and processing their own food. Does it need to be validated by science? No. Maybe science can help understand those chemical processes in there, but it's not a matter of validation, but it's a matter of sharing knowledge. So these are the processes that we do, and the chemist or whoever is on the science side saying yes, and this happens because these are the different chemical structures that go into play with that. So it's about decentering hegemonic notions and how can we bring them both together. So thinking about situating land, place, and space. So again, always important to acknowledge whose land you're on, because again, it's with gratitude that we are on a land that is sustaining and helping us to produce this knowledge. But then also, thinking about, based on this land, for those who are the original caretakers and for those of us that are living on the land, like what is that relationship between place? What are those meanings that people make out of place? We can think about like immigrants, and when they come into different places, how are they using the resources there to recreate their, to recreate their sense of place from where they're from? What are they taking into, what are they adapting in this new place in order to recreate something new? So those of you that are especially doing any type of environmental or place-based related research, those are important questions to ask, and not assuming again, this neutral stance about environment, about place, about green living, about all of those constructs. Because if you think about, there's a lot of memes that go around that you can go into the refrigerator of, a Jamaican, a Puerto Rican, a Thai person, and if you see a plastic thing that says yogurt, most likely if you open it, it's not going to be yogurt, it's going to be something else. It's going to be some type of leftover food or some sauces preparation. So if we think about who has been living a green lifestyle, we can think about how different people have been living a low footprint lifestyle by adapting and using resources at hand, and not necessarily coming from this very dominant culture perspective of what that means. Okay, finding the one again. Privilege, process over product. Very, very important. I know there's a lot of movement towards like slow research, slow teaching, and all of that type of stuff. So, but thinking about that process. And I know for, when you're doing your dissertation, it's a hard thing to consider because, you want that thing to be done, but then you still want to engage in your research in a way that you're building trust, that you're learning with the people who are involved in your research, and maybe start to think about, well, how can you, get to that end point in your research while it's still being a process, and while people who are engaged in it still being a process. And then maybe the product is not a finished point, but maybe it's a midpoint where, and there's some type of aspect of it that's still going on, because this is a way of building trust, of building relationships, and trust building and relationship building is very important to a lot of people, but specifically when you think about racialized people and the different ways that we live in and with community, that is a very important aspect of it. Okay, and promote participatory learning and research. So what are ways that you engage different people in that learning process, in the research process? How do you allow people that place to empower and to take ownership of their learning, and not only of what they're learning, but how they learn it? And this is easier like in informal science and place-based context, even though we, there's still often the tendency to like impose certain approaches and standards and bodies of knowledge on people. But how can you let go of some of that and allow people to think about, well, what is important to them? What do I want to learn about this context within this particular theme that we're exploring? So now I don't remember if that was my last one or, so that was like the last tenet. So basically I like to think about, how do we transform science education to fit learners, and not transforming learners to fit into science education? Because right now, science education is still like a box. And although there's a lot of us that are working to make the lines in the box more blurry, but we want to continue to blur those lines and eventually ameliorate those boundaries between science and community, so that whatever is coming from the knowledge production is benefiting a range of people and not just a narrow perspective, narrow group of people with narrow, narrow values and goals. Okay, so I will stop there, and any Q&A, and yeah. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much. We really, really appreciate it, Dr. Adams. There are a couple questions in the chat. I can read those to you if you'd like to check those out.
Yeah. I mean, if you want, you can read them to me, because I kind of get sometimes distracted, and
Sure. So lots of cool links referencing many of the resources that you provided. Olivia has a warning, blunt question. How do we get white men to care? Even looking at the demographics of this Zoom meeting, I see bias towards who is interested. What advice do you have for an optimistic scientist?
Well, I think and that's a good question, because I mean, I'm dealing with that here, and it's a question I don't think with an easy answer, but I think, and I will just go from, because I have like a good friend who is a white male, he's a physicist, and he's on a learning journey. And the good thing about it is because he's open to learn. And so I know that, and that's not always the case. And I think that what has been helping him are not only our conversations, and very frank conversations about, this is my experience. Like I talk to him about from my experience, and this is what I have experienced, and this is what my students have experienced. I think it's the more to be able to put them in conversation with people who have had those experiences. And when I say conversation, I don't mean putting racialized people in the role of teaching them. I'm talking about having conversations, to say, this is what I experienced when I went into a lab and people saw me there, and this is what they said, so being able to have those conversations, and I think that the more that we are able to engage in conversations, the more that people will open up. And I know that there are still a lot of people, especially like white males, that are dug in because they feel like they have something to lose. They feel like, well, if I were up to, if I were to get into this school at this point, I probably wouldn't have got in. And it's like, yeah, well, maybe not, but and that's what happens when people feel like they have something to lose. So if we're coming from a perspective of, well, what do we all have to gain by having diverse scientists? What are some of those ways that the science can open up so that, the discoveries that happen, the so-called patents that are coming out of it, are more relevant to a wide range of people. So I think if we focus on having conversations and talking more to the benefits of having diverse voices, then that will hopefully bring a lot of people more into saying, what, this is important for us to consider. Yeah, I don't know if that's helpful, but like what I said, that's a tough question, because it's something that I'm still navigating myself, I
know something with all of our advanced work for women in STEM, I mean, the NSF even requires for most of those projects as a co-PI to have a male, because those conversations are so important and that leadership is so important. And I think there are lots of white males interested in these conversations. I know today being Women's Day, there was some discussion related to what you were talking about people having hip replacements and medical devices, and that they've been all designed for the male anatomy as opposed to the female. And so there are so many things out there that need proper solutions to meet more people's needs. Another question from Candace, one of our doc students: how do we find balance between changing science ed to fit learners with developing stable STEM identities among students?
I guess I need to understand, how are you defining stable STEM identity?
Hi, Dr. Adams. So this is Candace. I'm the student that asked the question. What I mean is that since it's going to be a slow process to try to change science education to fit learners, we still have to prepare our students to be successful in these fields. So they still need to develop a stable professional identity that prepares them to be as successful as possible in these fields. Mm-hmm. So how do we find balance between those two goals?
And it's a good question, because I think about, well, one thing to think about is that even if it's a STEM identity, identities are not stable. And one of the ways, like I have a group here now that with a small group of Black STEM students, and one of the ways that I've been kind of approaching it is to how do you create more visibility for yourself and more of your, your own STEM identity? Like how are you, how are you shaping yourself as a scientist? And it's in the context of science communication. So it's about thinking about how do you want to, present yourself like as a scientist? Like how do you want to represent yourself and your own work? And it's about like giving students those tools, to empower themselves, to, how do you create like a space for students to develop that confidence? How do you create, for students, because I mean, the sense of belonging, that the onus of that is on, the people who are structuring the spaces to change. But how do you create that space for students to develop that sense of confidence? And and a lot of that has to do with like student interactions and the cohort work, and then also giving them the tools, the very real tools that they need to navigate like administrative structures. Like who do you go to when you have a question? What happens if you go to somebody and you have a question but you feel dismissed? Like how do you respond to that? So also giving them those very practical tools of being able to navigate those types of structures that are not yet going to be friendly to them. And, and just again, so that the onus is not on them to teach other people, but to be present and to be visible and to say, I'm here, I'm not going anywhere, this is what I need, this is the office that I'm supposed to go to, and if you're unable to help me, I am going to go to the level up next to you. The level up, and and it is more work, because I'm even navigating that now at my level, as a professor, of getting some of the resources that I need, and so I just have to keep leveling it up, and it's work and it's exhausting, but I hate to say it, but that's the only way that we're going to make ourselves more visible, and then make it hopefully easier for those who are coming, very quickly behind us.
I got to speak and then go. Dr. Adams, well done. Like, kudos to this faculty. You are doing amazing this semester. As the ARA chair for push out in STEM education and Blacks in STEMs, I think, Dr. Adams, you are doing an amazing thing. And I have a lot of emails from Black students telling me they are push out and then what we're going to do. So I think the links Dr. Wale shared, I've collated them. I'm going to disseminate them for you. But I really feel like you need to speak for people on other platforms, because if not, Dr. Spickler and USM, I had not read much of your work. So let us have you in the space so you join the voices for us. That is all I'm saying. But it was super an amazing presentation. Well done, and keep it up. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I mean, that's what I do like to do that, because I think for me, I mean, it's easier for me to advocate for other people than for myself even, because like if one of my students is feeling something, I will go in there kind of like a mama bear, but then if it's me, I'm kind of a little bit more like, but I'm learning how to do that more for myself, so, and I think it's important for those of us to be, that way, for our students, it's important, and as we're developing our own voices, so it's an ongoing thing. And then in Canada here, it's been very interesting because a lot of the work in equity just has not existed. And since like everybody witnessed, you know, the murder of George Floyd, there's been like a very big push for equity. But then there's a lot of us like, you know, Black people, Black scientists that are pretty much saying that no, there's a good push and that's good, but this is how we want it done. You know, these are the things that we want to prioritize. These are the things that we feel that are important. So we're, you know, pushing back on any kind of like mandates that are coming from here and saying, no, this is what we know that needs to be done. And we're leveraging research from the United States and saying that this is what's happened, but now we need to know what's happening here in Canada, you know? So I
actually have one more question. This is Candace again. Does anybody else have a question before I ask? Okay. So with talks with a lot of colleagues and whatnot, I feel like a basic problem, and you address some of this, a lot of the strategies are going to require compassionate teaching, compassionate interactions, but the problem is a lot of marginalized people are just still not viewed as human, and it's just it's a very complex problem, but it's a very basic problem. So how do we take a step back and just start teaching people that everyone is truly human and needs to be treated with a certain level of respect, and we don't need to give gold stars for people for treating other people like humans? That's something you were always supposed to be doing.
Exactly. And I have one of my colleagues, Lynn Tran, and she's in Berkeley, and she's been working on a framework that's been centering, like what you said, compassion, empathy, and belonging, and using that for, you know, for people to have discussions about and thinking about ways, how do you humanize like students in general, let alone like racialized people, because there's often that faculty thing that you don't, you know, students become numbers too. But it is that that humanization process, because that requires like a change in thinking. So it is that ongoing, you know, it is that ongoing process of centering compassion, centering empathy, and centering justice, and then using that language and being intentional about it. Like, you know, those of us that know and how to use that language, being intentional, and then also in spaces, and then when people are starting to use that language, having, you know, holding them accountable to being intentional about, well, how are you being compassionate, you know, with the students that are in your classroom, especially those who don't look like you, you know, what are the ways that you're empathizing with your students, you know, what are those ways? And then, you know, and then also I think it's important too, and not to like, you know, to expose people to the history of why scientifically Black people and Indigenous people have been, and how they have been, or how we have been, you know, how we have been dehumanized, because that's a lot of things. That's the thing that people do not necessarily know. It's just kind of like a taken for granted type of way of being. Like, there was something that I just recently either heard or saw, and I didn't get a chance to look into it, but there was a research that says that, you know, white people tend to look at racialized people as objects rather than humans. And I want to like Google that a little bit more and see. That was just like a couple of days ago that came up. And so that would be very important, like that would have very important implications for thinking about, well, how do we go about these initiatives where we are, you know, where we want people to be treated, you know, as equal humans and have that sense of belonging in different spaces. So, you know, so again, Cam, this is it's not an easy, question to answer, but it's more about a process of how do people like learn to have compassion for others? How do we, you know, assert our humanity? Because that's also us. We know we're human, but we also have to learn how to assert our humanity in different spaces, you know, because again, we are a part of this system where certain ways of being and ideologies that, you know, we also take for granted if if they're unexamined, you know. So we also have to think about that for ourselves as well. So it's about like saying, you know, again, like we're here and, you know, we're not going anywhere. We are human. We have much to, you know, contribute. And if you can't accept me here, I'm going to go to the next person above you. You know what I mean? And it is a lot of work, and it is exhausting. And I know, again, because I'm experiencing it, but it's you know, it's a process that has to happen. And then also within it, it's also practicing self-care, you know. And I also think I can't you know, emphasize how important that is, just so that you know you're not reaching that point of just being totally like discouraged that the fight is, you know, is done. And it is a fight, you know, unfortunately. So, you know, I see the time, and I know that I didn't probably answer the question, but it's just a, you know, a process. I'm going to put my email in the chat, and please feel free to follow up with me. I will be at NARST. I don't know how many people are going to be at NARST, you know, but so if you're going to be there, you know, feel free to come by and say hi. You know, and we're going to have a very interesting panel, an international panel that looks at racial equity in STEM with a lot of really good, you know, researchers from, you know, United States, Canada, and, you know, a couple from the Netherlands as well. So, you know, just look through the program and, you know, check it out, check us out, and like feel free to keep in touch, you know. And thanks for having me in this space. And again, I'm sorry I ran a little bit late, but, you know, it was one of those like kind of days, and it's going to continue to be that kind of day.
Terrific. You've given us so much to think about, and this has been fantastic for our faculty, our graduate students, and all of our visitors. Thank you so much for your time. We really, really appreciate it. And please be sure to read the notes in the chat. There's lots of love for you there. So we really appreciate it, Jennifer. Thank you again.
Thank you so much. And thanks again for having me. And yeah, if you want to send the chat to me, I would be, you know, happy to read it through. So, because I'm going to go and prepare for a class now. All right, everybody, have a good day. And thanks again for having me.
Thanks. Bye now.
Bye.